In a tense courtroom in Washington, D.C., under the unblinking gaze of diplomats, journalists, and the world's most powerful eyes, Ibrahim Traoré, the young fearless leader of Burkina Faso, stood alone ready to challenge a global system that had long ignored his people's cries. Over 2,400 terrorist attacks ravaged his homeland, a relentless storm of violence and despair that seemed unstoppable. Yet with unwavering resolve, he dared to defy not just the chaos outside, but the forces of oppression that tried to control his nation's future. This is more than a story about a trial. It's a battle for justice, dignity, and sovereignty, a story that will forever change how you see global power and the courage it takes to confront it. Before we dive deeper, a gentle reminder: while this tale blends fact with storytelling, and some details are imagined for dramatic effect, the emotions, the struggles, and the spirit you're about to witness are very real. This is a story of hope, defiance, and the fight for a better world. Are you ready to witness a moment where one voice stood tall against the might of an empire, and the world had no choice but to listen? The sky over Washington, D.C. was a relentless curtain of gray pressing down on the city like a warning. Outside the towering federal courthouse, rain hammered the windows in a deafening rhythm, a chaotic symphony of nature's fury. Thunder rolled ominously in the distance, sending sharp vibrations through the air, as if the heavens themselves were preparing for a momentous clash inside those walls. Inside the courthouse, the tension was almost palpable, thick enough to choke on. Diplomats from continents far and wide whispered urgently among themselves, their polished shoes tapping anxiously against the cold marble floors. Journalists adjusted their lenses and microphones, fingers poised over keyboards and cameras ready to capture every moment. Plainclothes intelligence agents moved discreetly through the crowd, eyes sharp and vigilant, blending into the sea of spectators but unmistakably present. Every person in that room knew this was no ordinary day, no routine hearing. It was an event that would ripple far beyond the courthouse's stone facade. Amid this swirling undercurrent of anticipation, a figure stood apart: Marcus Weston, the assistant U.S. attorney. Weston's presence filled the room with an almost predatory energy. With a slow, calculating smile, sharp like a wolf sensing the hunt, he arranged his papers meticulously on the desk. His crimson tie was perfectly straight, a stark contrast to the storm raging outside, symbolizing the order and control he believed he wielded here. His eyes flicked toward the empty defendant's chair, already picturing the victory that awaited him. The whispers around him were unmistakable. Traoré refuses legal counsel. He's coming alone. No translator, no team. Such defiance was rare, reckless even, and it thrilled Weston. To him, this was a guaranteed triumph. The idea of facing a lone, unprepared man only made his smile widen. But beneath that smile there was a crack, a hint of unease that even Weston refused to acknowledge. The courtroom buzzed with rumors and speculation. Who was this man who dared to stand in the lion's den without a shield? How could one man, young and relatively unknown on the global stage, challenge the might of a nation that wielded courts and laws like weapons? Those questions hung in the air like an electric charge, setting nerves on edge, and yet no one could deny it. The atmosphere was charged with an eerie electricity, a sense that something unprecedented was about to unfold. The usual formalities, the scripted dialogues, the predictable motions of justice, none of that seemed to apply today. From the sharp intake of breath by a seasoned diplomat to the steady hand of a journalist who paused mid-note, all signs pointed to a trial that would rewrite expectations. Outside, the storm continued to rage, mirroring the brewing storm within. This was more than a courtroom. It was a battleground where history would be written, where power and principle would collide in ways no one dared predict. As the clock ticked down to the moment the defendant would enter, the world held its breath, watching, waiting for a spectacle, for a scandal, or perhaps for a revelation. This was not going to be a trial like any other. And in that charged silence, one truth echoed louder than all the stakes had never been higher. The heavy wooden door at the back of the courtroom creaked open, drawing every eye in the room. A hush fell over the crowd as Ibrahim Traoré stepped into the chamber alone. No entourage flanked him. No translators whispered in his ear. He wore a simple olive green military uniform devoid of medals or insignia, carrying only a modest briefcase in one hand. There was no pomp, no grand entrance, just a man who carried himself with quiet authority. The initial reaction was disbelief. Whispers rippled through the room. "Is this it? This plain-looking young man?" A European diplomat scoffed softly, shaking his head. How could this be the leader causing all the turmoil? Some attendees exchanged skeptical glances, dismissing him as insignificant, a mere figurehead, unlikely to sway the mighty machinery of American justice. Journalists poised their pens and cameras, eager for drama, yet many found themselves questioning what they saw. Here was no theatrical rebel or brash revolutionary, just a calm, steady figure whose presence defied the expectations of a man summoned to face a powerful adversary on foreign soil. Traoré's gaze swept the courtroom, meeting the eyes of the judge without hesitation. There was no trace of fear, no flicker of anger. Instead, his posture was upright, his breathing even and controlled. His defiance was silent but unmistakable, an unyielding calm that spoke louder than any shout. It was clear he did not view himself as a victim, but as a voice of conviction, standing firm in the face of overwhelming odds. The judge, Eleanor Richards, a woman with decades on the bench, studied Traoré closely. Her silver-streaked hair framed a face hardened by years of law and conflict, yet in that moment curiosity softened her usually stern expression. This was not the defendant she had prepared for. There was something about him, his poise, the quiet strength that unsettled the familiar patterns of courtroom procedure. Questions flickered through her mind. Who was this man? What made him so resolute? Was this trial about justice or something far more complex? The tension in the room thickened as the reality settled. Here stood a young African leader summoned thousands of miles from home to answer charges leveled by one of the world's most powerful nations. His crime, defiance, a refusal to bow to pressures designed to maintain and establish global order. His challenge was not merely legal, but symbolic, a stand against centuries of imposed authority. In that charged silence, the stakes crystallized. This was more than a courtroom drama. It was a confrontation of narratives, an unfolding test of sovereignty and power. Every whispered doubt, every scoff of disbelief only underscored the precariousness of the moment. Could a solitary man, stripped of all but his conviction, truly shake the foundations of international dominance? As Traoré took his place unaccompanied and unwavering, the world seemed to hold its breath. What was about to unfold would challenge not only the law, but the very idea of who gets to write history. And for those watching, the question loomed, could the quiet defiance of one man topple the roar of an empire? The courtroom fell silent as Judge Eleanor Richards adjusted her glasses and called the proceedings to order. The court will now hear the case of the United States government versus Ibrahim Traoré, acting head of state of Burkina Faso. Her voice was steady, carrying the weight of decades on the bench. The gallery leaned in, cameras focused intently. This was the moment the prosecution would lay bare its charges. Assistant U.S. Attorney Marcus Weston rose, his crimson tie catching the dim light, his voice resonant and deliberate. Your Honor, under the Global Accountability Act of 2023, the United States brings forth charges against Mr. Traoré for violations that threaten international security and stability. He paused, allowing the gravity of his words to settle. These charges include destabilization of regional alliances, unauthorized military restructuring, and deliberate interference with the distribution of humanitarian aid. A murmur rippled through the courtroom. The terms sounded clinical, almost procedural, but the implications were vast political accusations veiled in legal language. The Global Accountability Act itself was a subject of fierce debate. Critics decried it as a modern tool of neocolonialism, a legislative mechanism through which Western powers could legally challenge and undermine leaders who dared defy their interests. It was to many less about justice and more about control, a sword wielded under the guise of law to maintain global hierarchies. This was the first major test case under the Act, and all eyes were fixed on how it would unfold. When the judge asked Mr. Traoré, "Do you understand the charges against you?" the young leader rose calmly. His English was flawless, his accent subtle but unmistakably authentic. "I understand what is being said, Your Honor," he replied, his voice steady. Then came the moment that sent a ripple through the courtroom. "Do you have legal representation?" "I represent myself," Traoré stated plainly. The court strongly advised against it, but he interrupted gently. With respect, Your Honor, if I cannot defend myself, then I should not be here at all. His words were simple but profound, a direct challenge to the entire premise of the trial. When asked how he pleaded, Traoré's expression remained unreadable. I do not plead anything. I am here to speak truth. The rest is formality. The prosecutor's confident smirk faltered, replaced by a flicker of uncertainty. This was not the compliant defendant they expected. The courtroom shifted. Journalists stopped typing, diplomats exchanged uneasy glances, and even the judge's pen hesitated over her notepad. Traoré was not scrambling for legal loopholes. He was upending the established narrative. He refused to be reduced to a mere defendant within a system that to him represented the interests of a few powerful nations, rather than true international law. The tension tightened the room, holding its breath, as the trial meant to assert dominance was quietly but unmistakably challenged by a man who spoke with unwavering clarity and purpose. The stage was set for a confrontation far beyond legal arguments. It was a battle for legitimacy, for sovereignty, and for the very meaning of justice itself. As the prosecutor prepared to launch into his questioning, a palpable tension gripped the courtroom. Marcus Weston stepped forward, his voice sharp and commanding. Mr. Traoré, do you recognize the authority of this court to question your actions as a head of state? The question hung in the air, a trap disguised as formality. If Traoré answered yes, he would be surrendering his sovereignty. If no, he risked appearing defiant and uncooperative. Traoré looked up slowly, his gaze steady and unwavering. There was no anger, no fear, only clarity and resolve. No, he said simply. The courtroom gasped. Murmurs rippled through the crowd as shock and disbelief washed over diplomats, journalists, and legal officials alike. The judge's brow furrowed, a clear sign she was grappling with this unexpected defiance. Weston's poised confidence began to waver. So you admit you do not respect international law, he pressed. Traoré met the challenge calmly. I respect law that is truly international, he replied evenly, not law written by a few nations to control many. His words echoed through the chamber, bold and unsettling. The judge leaned forward, her voice measured but firm. Mr. Traoré, while I appreciate your position, I must remind you that this court operates under established legal frameworks. Traoré nodded respectfully but stood his ground. Your Honor, I am here voluntarily out of respect for dialogue, but I cannot pretend that my presence validates the premise of these proceedings. His tone was steady, authoritative. He was not merely refusing to cooperate, he was demanding recognition for his sovereignty. A hush fell over the room. The murmurs quieted, replaced by a tense anticipation. This was no longer a routine hearing. Traoré had disrupted the script, forcing everyone present to confront uncomfortable questions about power, legitimacy, and justice. Journalists stopped typing mid-sentence, diplomats exchanged uneasy glances, and even the judge hesitated, her pen poised uncertainly over her notepad. The court, built on centuries of precedent and the unchallenged authority of powerful nations, was facing a bold challenge from a single man who refused to play by its rules. Traoré's refusal to accept the court's authority was not an act of rebellion for its own sake. It was a profound assertion of the right of his nation to self-determination. His calm but unwavering demeanor transformed the courtroom into a stage for a larger conversation about colonial legacies and modern sovereignty. This was more than a trial. It was a confrontation between old power structures and a new voice demanding respect and dignity. Traoré's presence was voluntary, but his demands for acknowledgement and dialogue were non-negotiable. The courtroom was caught between enforcing its authority and acknowledging the legitimacy of the man who stood before it. In that charged silence, the atmosphere thickened with boldness and empowerment. Traoré's stance challenged not just the legality of the charges, but the very foundations of international order, as dictated by the powerful few. His words struck a chord far beyond the walls of the courthouse, resonating with those who had long felt silenced or marginalized. The judge, though struggling to maintain control, could not dismiss the weight of his arguments. The courtroom had shifted. What began as a straightforward prosecution had become a profound challenge to the status quo. Traoré was no longer just a defendant. He was a symbol of resistance and the voice of a nation demanding its rightful place on the global stage. Marcus Weston straightened his posture and fixed his gaze on Ibrahim Traoré, sensing the moment to play his strongest card had arrived. Mr. Traoré, in March of last year, you expelled French military forces stationed in Burkina Faso, forces that were part of a long-standing counterterrorism effort. Weston began voice steady but edged with accusation. Following your decision, extremist violence in the region surged dramatically. How do you justify endangering your own citizens by dismantling an essential security framework? The courtroom fell into a heavy silence, the weight of the accusation hanging like a dark cloud. Traoré's face remained calm, his eyes fixed somewhere beyond the immediate confrontation. For a long moment he said nothing. The tension thickened as all waited for his response. Then slowly Traoré reached into his pocket and withdrew a small worn photograph. His voice, soft but resolute, broke the silence. "Your Honor, may I approach the bench?" The judge nodded, curiosity flickering in her eyes. Traoré handed the photo to Judge Richards. The image was haunting a village, devastated tin roofs collapsed, smoke rising from burnt-out homes and scattered bodies lying motionless on the ground. "This was taken 3 days before I made the decision to ask French forces to leave," he explained quietly. "The village is Tinikoff. 46 civilians were killed while French troops were stationed less than 20 kilometers away. This was the 8th massacre that month." A murmur swept through the courtroom, some faces pale with shock. Weston's confident expression faltered as the reality of the photograph settled. The prosecutor tried to maintain composure, but the narrative was shifting under his feet. Traoré's voice grew stronger as he continued, the moral weight of his words filling the chamber. "For years, foreign soldiers patrolled our streets, supposedly protecting us from terrorism. Yet our people continued to die, not metaphorically, but literally. Our children attended school under trees because there were no proper facilities. Corporations drilled into our lands, extracting wealth while our communities suffered." He paused, letting the gravity sink in. "For a decade, we were told to be patient. Security would come if we followed their instructions. Prosperity would follow if we signed the right contracts. But this patience brought only death and despair." Weston interjected sharply. "Isolated tragic incidents do not justify dismantling an entire security framework critical to regional stability." Traoré's gaze locked onto the prosecutor, unwavering. "From the moment I took power, our country faced relentless attacks over 2,405 years under that very framework. After we replaced foreign troops with our own volunteers, attacks dropped by 60% within 6 months. The courtroom stirred a shift palpable in the air. This was not the script the prosecution had prepared. "I made a choice," Traoré declared, his voice measured, but filled with conviction. "Not for applause, not for comfort, but for sovereignty. I rejected help that came with chains." He looked directly at Weston. "If that disturbs this courtroom, then perhaps the problem is not me, but the mirror I hold up." A heavy silence followed, broken only by the faint scratching of pens and shifting in seats. The photograph, a silent witness, spoke louder than any argument. Traoré had exposed a harsh truth: the so-called protectors had failed to protect, and the people had paid with their lives. In this moment, the trial transcended legal bounds. It became a reckoning with the cost of control, the price of imposed security, and the enduring struggle for a nation's right to defend itself on its own terms. Ibrahim Traoré's calm voice filled the courtroom as he began to explain the drastic measures taken after expelling foreign troops. "Your Honor," he said, "we replaced the foreign military presence with our own civilian volunteers and military forces born from the very communities under attack." His eyes swept across the room, locking momentarily with the skeptical gaze of Assistant U.S. Attorney Marcus Weston. "This wasn't just a symbolic gesture," Traoré continued, "but a strategic shift grounded in trust and responsibility. Within 6 months, terrorist attacks in Burkina Faso dropped by 60%. A murmur spread through the courtroom, whispers of surprise and disbelief, weaving among diplomats, journalists, and observers alike. Weston's lips tightened. He shuffled through his notes, searching for a rebuttal, but the evidence Traoré presented was undeniable and sharply contradicted the prosecution's narrative of reckless endangerment. The stark drop in violence was a testament to the efficacy of the new security model, one rooted in local empowerment rather than foreign imposition. Traoré leaned forward, slightly emphasizing his next point. "For too long, our people were told that security required foreign boots on our soil, boots that often failed to protect us. But it is our own people who understand our communities, who have the deepest stake in defending them. His voice grew firmer, yet remained measured and respectful. When those closest to the danger take responsibility, the results speak for themselves. The courtroom's energy shifted palpably. Journalists lowered their pens, diplomats exchanged glances, and even some of Weston's colleagues appeared unsettled. The young leader was not only defending his actions, but challenging the very assumptions held by the prosecution and by extension by the powers behind them. Weston finally found his voice again, though it carried a hint of hesitation. Mr. Traoré, is it not true that welcoming foreign mercenaries such as those from the Wagner Group undermines the legitimacy of your sovereignty? How can replacing one foreign force with another be an act of true independence? Traoré met the question without hesitation. We have agreements with multiple nations, including Russia, Turkey, and Iran, he acknowledged. But unlike previous arrangements, these partnerships do not demand control over our resources, do not impose permanent bases, nor exercise authority over our citizens. His eyes burned with quiet determination. The difference is not which foreigners are present, but who holds the power to decide the terms of their presence. Sweat beaded on Weston's brow as the courtroom's air conditioning struggled against the growing tension. Traoré's words were dismantling the prosecution's carefully constructed case, exposing a deeper critique of international double standards. Is it not true then, Traoré continued, that the so-called international community you reference represents less than 20% of the world's population? Beyond your media bubble, there are diverse perspectives on which governments deserve sanction and which do not. A gasp echoed from a journalist in the third row. No one spoke like this in an American courtroom. No one dared to challenge the foundational assumptions upon which the questions themselves were built. Yet Traoré was here to speak a truth far larger than legal formalities. Weston retreated to his table, visibly agitated, flipping through his papers. His prepared questions now seemed inadequate in the face of Traoré's unyielding clarity. The courtroom was no longer a stage for a scripted prosecution, but a forum for a revolutionary challenge to the global order. Marcus Weston's voice sharpened as he leaned forward, eyes fixed intently on Ibrahim Traoré. Mr. Traoré, your rise to power was hardly the product of democratic elections. Many would label it a coup, a seizure of authority without the consent of the people. His words hung in the air, a pointed accusation designed to undermine Traoré's legitimacy. Traoré met the challenge with quiet confidence. When elections become mere theater, a puppet show orchestrated by those in power, what value do the ballots truly hold? His voice was steady, but carried a simmering defiance. My people did not vote with ballots, they voted with trust. And trust cannot be forged in a rigged system or bought with promises that go unfulfilled. He reached into his jacket and pulled out a folded photograph, handing it to the judge. The image was stark, 3 young boys standing on dirt paths with burnt-out homes behind them, faces etched with hardship and despair. This, Traoré said softly, is what democracy looked like under those leaders who claimed to represent us. Empty promises, corruption, and full graves. A murmur swept through the courtroom, the weight of the image silencing many. The photo was a powerful testament to lives neglected and voices unheard. Traoré's point was clear: formal elections meant little if they failed to deliver real change or respect for the people's dignity. Democracy is not a foreign script to be imposed, he continued, but a living, breathing commitment to the people's will. It is not merely the casting of votes, but the trust earned through genuine representation and accountability. His eyes swept the room, challenging each listener to reconsider the narrow definitions often imposed by Western standards. Weston attempted to regain ground, but surely Mr. Traoré's legitimacy comes from the ballot box and the rule of law. Without it, how can your leadership be accepted on the world stage? Traoré shook his head gently. Legitimacy is not granted by external recognition or international acceptance alone. It is earned on the streets, in the homes, and in the hearts of the people who live the realities of governance every day. His tone softened with empathy. When elections become a performance and chosen leaders, puppets, true democracy dies. I did not take power from the people, I took it from those who had already stolen it from them. The courtroom was silent, even the most hardened observers caught in the gravity of his words. Here was a leader redefining democracy, not as a checkbox or a ceremony, but as a profound relationship between ruler and ruled, a bond built on trust, accountability, and shared struggle. Weston's challenge had been expected, but Traoré's response was unexpected in its depth and humanity. He had reframed the debate, shifting it from legal technicalities to the moral core of governance. The tension rose, but so did a new understanding among those present, a recognition that democracy might wear many faces, and not all of them fit the Western mold. As Traoré folded the photograph carefully and returned it to his pocket, the courtroom seemed to lean in closer, drawn by the promise of a story not just about politics, but about real people and their yearning for justice. Ibrahim Traoré's posture shifted slightly, a subtle but profound moment of vulnerability that did not escape the courtroom's watchful eyes. "I regret," he began slowly, his voice steady, yet carrying the weight of years lived under pressure, not acting sooner. The words were simple, but the implication profound. A leader's burden weighed heavy with the cost of delay. The silence that followed was filled with unspoken understanding. Leadership was not easy, and hindsight revealed painful truths. "There were moments when I believed the world would come to our aid when we cried out." He continued, eyes scanning the room, connecting with faces both sympathetic and skeptical. "I regret believing respect could be requested rather than earned or taken." His voice grew firmer, resonating with an honesty that commanded attention. Leadership is not about false promises or easy solutions. It demands hard choices, sacrifices, and the courage to stand when others falter. This confession marked a turning point in the courtroom's atmosphere. The tension that had thickened over the previous hours softened, replaced by a budding respect for the man who stood not just as a defendant, but as a leader grappling with immense responsibility. Traoré paused, letting his words settle before continuing. "I ask only for recognition, not as a privilege granted by others, but as a right inherent to every nation and its people. Sovereignty is not a favor, it is fundamental." His gaze was unwavering, the conviction clear. "We seek not permission to govern ourselves, but acknowledgement of our dignity and our capacity to chart our own future." Judge Richards, who had maintained a firm judicial demeanor throughout, softened her tone. Her questions shifted from formal interrogation to genuine inquiry. "Mr. Traoré, leadership under such circumstances is undoubtedly challenging. How do you reconcile the sacrifices made with the hopes of your people?" The courtroom leaned in as Traoré answered with humility and resolve. "There will be setbacks," he admitted, "pain and difficult decisions. The path we have chosen is steep and fraught, but it is the only path that leads to true freedom." He looked around the room, his voice steady but impassioned. "Our people have tasted dignity, and having tasted it, they will accept nothing less." His words transcended the political, touching on universal themes of resilience and hope. Even those predisposed to doubt found themselves moved by his candor. The judge's pen moved again, this time with a less rigid stroke, as if the boundaries between law and humanity were momentarily blurred. Weston, sensing the shift, remained silent for a moment, his usual assertiveness tempered by the weight of Traoré's honesty. The trial had begun as an attempt to expose a defiant leader, but now it revealed a man burdened by the complexities of leadership, struggling to balance the harsh realities of governance with the aspirations of his people. The courtroom, once a battleground, had transformed into a space of dialogue and reflection. Traoré was no longer merely a defendant. He was a figure embodying the struggle for dignity, sovereignty, and justice. As the session drew to a close, an unspoken acknowledgement passed between the judge and the man before her. This was not a simple case of right or wrong, but a profound conversation about the rights of nations and the courage to defend them. The courtroom was electric with tension as Marcus Weston rose once again, his voice sharp and unyielding. "Mr. Traoré, since taking power, you have canceled multiple contracts with Western mining companies. You seized control of gold mines and redirected their profits to your government. These actions have cost shareholders billions and violated international investment agreements. How do you justify such blatant disregard for the rules of international commerce?" He slammed a thick report on the evidence table, its pages filled with figures in legalese that painted a grim picture of economic disruption. Traoré glanced at the document but did not touch it. Instead, he repeated the words, slowly emphasizing its irony. "Legitimate." He turned toward the judge, his expression unchanging. Your Honor, I ask what makes a contract legitimate? His voice was calm, but carried a quiet fire beneath. This particular mining contract allocated 92% of profits to the foreign company. It was signed by an official who received a villa in Monaco the following month. The courtroom absorbed the accusation, the implication impossible to ignore. Traoré continued painting a vivid portrait of exploitation hidden beneath legal agreements. The contract permitted the use of cyanide leaching methods banned in Europe and America. It allowed unlimited groundwater extraction in drought-prone regions. It required government forces to protect company assets, but forbade inspection of mining conditions. His words landed like quiet explosions, each detail exposing the environmental degradation and social harm inflicted upon his people. He paused briefly, letting the weight of his argument settle over the room. We did not cancel these contracts, Your Honor. We corrected them. His gaze swept the courtroom slowly. The mines still operate, and the companies still profit, but no longer excessively and no longer at the expense of our children's health and future. Weston slammed his palm on the table, frustration evident. That is not how international commerce works. You cannot unilaterally change terms because you dislike them. His voice was raised, but the judge quickly raised her hand. Mr. Weston, please control yourself, she said, her tone firm but measured. Traoré seized the moment to respond, voice calm but resolute. When those terms were unilaterally imposed through corruption and coercion, correction is not only our right, it is our duty. His eyes swept the gallery. Many here represent nations that have rewritten financial rules whenever it suited them. Banks were bailed out, debts forgiven, terms adjusted. But when African nations seek similar recalibrations, contracts become sacred and inviolable. The room was silent, the double standard laid bare for all to see. Traoré leaned forward, slightly emphasizing his point. If economic sovereignty is a crime, then I am guilty. But so is every nation that has ever chosen its people's welfare over foreign profits. A Ukrainian diplomat in the front row began to applaud softly, drawing a sharp warning glance from a court officer. Yet the moment was telling. Some among the global audience recognized the justice in Traoré's words. The judge's expression remained unreadable, but the air in the courtroom had shifted. Weston's confident stance was faltering. Traoré's critique was more than a legal defense. It was a powerful awakening to centuries of economic exploitation disguised as legitimate business. He challenged the very foundations of international economic relations, demanding that the wealth beneath his people's feet serve their prosperity, not foreign shareholders. As the prosecution faltered, the courtroom seemed to lean toward a new understanding. The young leader was no longer just a defendant defending controversial policies. He was a voice demanding justice, equity, and respect for his nation's right to economic self-determination. The mining contracts were no longer merely business agreements. They were symbols of a larger struggle against economic imperialism, and Traoré was at the forefront of that battle. The courtroom air grew charged as Ibrahim Traoré leaned forward, his voice steady but filled with unyielding boldness. Let us not forget, he began, that many of the richest nations in this world have rewritten financial rules whenever it suited their interests. Banks were bailed out, debts forgiven, and contracts adjusted without hesitation when it benefited them. His gaze swept over the assembly, ensuring his message landed hard. If exercising economic sovereignty is a crime, then countless nations, not just those in Africa, would be guilty of the same offense. A wave of murmurs spread through the room, a mix of surprise and unease at the directness of his statement. Traoré's words peeled back layers of hypocrisy embedded in the international economic system, exposing a glaring double standard. Western nations were quick to enforce rules on others, but exempted themselves when convenient. The courtroom, once so confident and rigid, now faced the weight of this uncomfortable truth. For a brief moment, a ripple of applause erupted from the crowd, shocking many present. It was soft and tentative, quickly subdued by the stern glance of a court officer, but its significance was undeniable. Even among the formality and tension, some acknowledged the justice in Traoré's declaration. This was not merely a legal argument, it was a call for equity and honesty on the global stage. Marcus Weston's usual air of assuredness began to falter. His fingers nervously tapped the edge of his notes as he glanced toward Judge Richards, searching for support. Yet the judge's expression had shifted. Her once unwavering gaze now softened into contemplation. The relentless prosecution was no longer dictating the narrative. Instead, it was clear the courtroom was grappling with deeper questions about fairness and sovereignty. Traoré pressed on undeterred by the changing dynamics. Economic sovereignty is not a favor granted by powerful nations. It is a fundamental right of every people to determine how their resources and wealth are managed. To punish a nation for reclaiming control over its own economy is to deny its very dignity. His voice was firm, resonant with conviction. The courtroom's energy shifted palpably as Traoré's message reverberated beyond legal jargon into the realm of moral imperative. Diplomats exchanged uneasy glances. Journalists paused, capturing the moment that challenged long-held assumptions. The weight of centuries of exploitation and inequality was being laid bare in that very room. Weston, regaining some composure, attempted to reframe the argument. Mr. Traoré, international investment agreements exist to ensure stability and predictability, crucial for economic growth. Unilateral changes risk undermining investor confidence and harming development. His tone was sharper but lacked its previous certainty. Traoré met him calmly. Stability built on inequality and exploitation is no stability at all. Development that enriches a few while leaving millions in poverty is a failure. His words carried the collective frustration of those long marginalized by an economic system skewed against them. As he spoke, the courtroom felt the rising momentum of a challenge not just to a defendant, but to an entire system. Traoré was not merely defending his policies, he was demanding a new economic order, one that respected sovereignty, fairness, and shared prosperity. Judge Richards adjusted her glasses, her eyes meeting Traoré's, with a mixture of respect and introspection. The prosecution's case was no longer a straightforward indictment, but a complex dialogue on justice and power. The courtroom held its breath, suspended in a moment where law met conscience and a young leader's defiance sparked a call for change that echoed far beyond the walls of the courthouse. A hush fell over the courtroom as the reality of this disparity settled in. Traoré continued describing the systemic inefficiencies and the unintended consequences of such aid programs. These systems create dependency rather than resilience. They foster a cycle where communities rely on imported food and medicine instead of developing their own resources. Aid becomes a bandage, not a cure. He acknowledged the seriousness of the accusations, but reframed the narrative. We did not expel these organizations. We asked them to adapt, to purchase food locally, to train Burkinabe doctors instead of rotating foreign staff every 6 months, to coordinate with our government rather than operate as parallel authorities. Traoré's tone was firm but respectful. Some agreed and continued their work effectively. Others chose to leave rather than change. Weston attempted to counter, emphasizing the experience and expertise of these organizations. Your government's inexperience cannot simply rewrite decades of humanitarian best practices developed worldwide. These practices are designed to ensure aid reaches those who need it most. Traoré's voice rose slightly, carrying a mixture of frustration and hope. For 50 years, these best practices have failed to lift my country out of poverty or insecurity. At what point do we acknowledge that they may not be as effective as claimed? His words challenged the courtroom, demanding they reconsider assumptions about aid and development. The room remained silent, the emotional weight of his critique palpable. Traoré was not merely defending his policies, he was exposing the cracks in a global system that often perpetuated the very problems it sought to solve. In this moment, the trial transcended legal proceedings. It became a profound dialogue on dignity, autonomy, and the true meaning of assistance. Traoré's perspective resonated with those who had long questioned the status quo, but rarely heard such forthrightness in such a setting. As the judge called for a brief recess, the murmurs and exchanges among the audience reflected a shifting understanding. This was no longer just a defendant explaining policies. It was a leader articulating a vision for a new approach to humanitarian aid, one rooted in respect, partnership, and real empowerment. Ibrahim Traoré's voice carried a resolute conviction as he addressed the court, pushing beyond mere defense toward a call for transformation. Your Honor, we did not ask humanitarian organizations to leave. He emphasized we asked them to change, to adapt their methods to the realities of Burkina Faso. His gaze swept across the room, inviting understanding and reflection. He outlined the specific reforms his government proposed, purchasing food locally to support farmers and reduce dependency on imports, training Burkinabe doctors and health workers rather than cycling through foreign staff every 6 months, and crucially coordinating efforts closely with the national government to ensure aid complemented, not undermined, local systems. These measures were designed not to hinder aid but to build resilience and foster genuine empowerment. Some organizations accepted these changes and continue their work effectively today. Traoré acknowledged his tone respectful yet firm. Others refused, choosing instead to withdraw, unwilling to relinquish control or adjust to our sovereignty. The courtroom felt the underlying tension between the principles of autonomy and the established norms of international aid, a clash that went beyond bureaucratic procedures to touch on issues of respect and power. Traoré challenged the notion of best practices in humanitarian aid, a term often repeated but seldom questioned. For 50 years, these best practices have governed aid delivery in Burkina Faso, yet our country remains poor, insecure, and vulnerable. His words were a quiet indictment of a system resistant to change, one that often treated symptoms rather than addressing root causes. The courtroom grew, still the gravity of his critique sinking deep. Journalists paused, diplomats exchanged thoughtful looks, and even the judge's pen hovered momentarily over her notepad. Here was a leader not merely contesting accusations, but inviting a fundamental reassessment of how aid should function, a call to rethink decades of established norms. Traoré's vision was clear: aid must be a partnership based on mutual respect and local knowledge, not a top-down imposition that perpetuates dependency. Our people deserve aid that builds their capacity, strengthens our institutions, and respects our sovereignty, he asserted. Only then can aid become a true instrument of change. The subtle tension in the room reflected the difficulty of this challenge. Changing entrenched systems is never easy. It requires willingness from all parties to adapt, listen, and share power. Traoré's words highlighted this struggle, emphasizing that progress demanded more than good intentions. It demanded courage and respect. The journey to sovereignty is neither easy nor quick, he said, voice growing stronger but never rising in volume. Dignity is hard-won, not given freely. Sovereignty is not a privilege bestowed by others, but a right we must claim and defend. His gaze swept across the courtroom, meeting eyes with judges, lawyers, journalists, and spectators alike. If this trial seeks to judge that struggle, then so be it. But know this: I stand not just for myself, but for my people who have waited too long to reclaim their future. The courtroom was silent, the impact of his words sinking deeply into every soul present. What had begun as a courtroom interrogation had become a powerful testimony, a declaration of resilience, courage, and the unbreakable spirit of a people. Judge Richards, usually composed and reserved, showed a flicker of emotion. Her pen hovered briefly over her notes before she carefully placed it down. The air was thick with respect and reflection. Even Marcus Weston, the prosecutor who had wielded authority with confidence all day, appeared momentarily disarmed. Traoré's admission was not weakness, but strength, an acknowledgement of the heavy cost of leadership and the painful lessons learned along the way. It humanized him in a way that no legal argument could, connecting him with everyone who has ever faced injustice or fought for something greater than themselves. As the tension eased, the courtroom seemed to shift. The trial was no longer just about laws or politics. It had become a story of humanity, sacrifice, and the relentless pursuit of justice. Weston quietly lowered his papers and nodded, signaling that he had no further questions. Traoré, standing tall and unwavering, had turned what was meant to be a moment of submission into a profound declaration of purpose. In that moment, the trial's dynamic had changed irrevocably. The weight of history pressed down, and the world watched as a young leader, burdened but unbowed, claimed his place not just in court, but in the narrative of a nation's rebirth. The courtroom was charged with an uneasy energy as Judge Richards finally spoke, her voice calm but firm. In light of the complexities raised during today's proceedings, the court will adjourn indefinitely to review jurisdictional matters and procedural questions. The official explanation was vague, offering no clear resolution, but the implication was unmistakable. The trial was suspended, put on hold indefinitely. Outside the courthouse, whispers and speculation swirled like the storm that still lashed Washington streets. But within hours, something remarkable began to unfold. Clips of Ibrahim Traoré's testimony, His calm defiance and unyielding truth exploded across social media platforms worldwide. Subtitled in dozens of languages, his words traveled from smartphones to lecture halls, from activist meetings to government offices, igniting discussions far beyond the walls of the courtroom. Students in Cairo debated his vision in university classrooms. Activists in Caracas hailed his courage. Political leaders in capitals across Africa, Latin America, and Asia began reconsidering long-held alliances and policies. Traoré's message was no longer confined to legal arguments. It had become a rallying cry for sovereignty, dignity, and resistance against systemic injustice. Just 3 days after the hearing, thousands of protesters flooded the streets outside the courthouse. They carried mirrors, simple yet powerful symbols that needed no explanation. The mirrors reflected their faces and those of the onlookers, a direct confrontation with the hypocrisy of a system that sought to judge a leader defending his nation's autonomy. The demonstration was peaceful but resolute, a collective refusal to accept the narrative imposed by distant powers. Major media outlets scrambled to adjust their coverage. CNN aired a special report titled "The Trial That Backfired," exploring how Traoré's testimony exposed cracks in Western foreign policy. The Guardian questioned the legitimacy of the Global Accountability Act in a pointed editorial, while even Fox News debated whether American diplomacy had become disconnected from on-the-ground realities. Behind closed doors, intense debates erupted within global capitals. Intelligence briefings that had once dismissed Traoré as a fleeting revolutionary were hastily revised. Senior officials mulled over new strategies to address the political ripple effect unleashed by one man's courtroom stand. One State Department official was overheard saying, "We need to understand what's happening here." In Washington and beyond, Traoré had become a figure of empowerment, a symbol that no longer fit the simplistic labels of coup leader or defiant rebel. His courage to speak uncomfortable truths had awakened a new discourse on power, justice, and sovereignty. As the weeks passed, the trial's suspension did not diminish its impact. Instead, it magnified it. Traoré's story became a beacon for those fighting colonial legacies and demanding recognition on their own terms. The courtroom's silence was replaced by a global chorus of voices advocating change. Ibrahim Traoré's return to Burkina Faso was nothing short of a triumphant homecoming. As his plane touched down on the tarmac of a modest airstrip outside the capital, Ouagadougou, the news of his arrival had already spread like wildfire. Thousands of people lined the 17-kilometer stretch of airport road, undeterred by the sweltering heat and dust. Women ululated, men beat drums in rhythmic celebration, and children perched on the shoulders of their parents waved handmade flags. It was a sea of faces, hopeful, proud, and eager, that welcomed a leader who had dared to confront the world's mightiest powers and emerge with his dignity intact. Traoré's vehicle moved slowly through the jubilant crowds, but unlike the grandiose displays typical of political processions, he stood through the sunroof not waving pompously, but raising his fist in simple solidarity. The energy was raw and genuine, a collective outpouring of pride and renewal. His leadership was no longer defined by the courtroom battles abroad, but by the tangible promise of change at home. At the presidential palace, Traoré addressed the nation directly, his voice steady and resolute. "They called me to their court thinking I would stand trial," he said, "but it was not I who was exposed. They believed our sovereignty was negotiable, our dignity had a price. They were wrong." His words resonated deeply with a population long accustomed to shame on the global stage. This moment was transcendent, a turning point not just for a man, but for an entire nation reclaiming its voice. But Traoré understood that rhetoric alone was insufficient. His cabinet met in solemn purpose, the mood focused and clear-eyed. "We have captured the world's attention," he told them. "Now we must convert it into action." Orders flowed swiftly: accelerate the rural electrification program, double production at the new pharmaceutical plant, fast-track agricultural irrigation projects. The tangible work of rebuilding had begun. The ripple effects extended beyond Burkina Faso's borders. Within a month, Mali and Niger announced the formation of a strengthened federation, with Burkina Faso pooling military resources and establishing a common investment framework, prioritizing regional businesses over foreign interests. Chad began renegotiating oil contracts, citing evolving standards for resource sovereignty. Even traditionally Western-aligned countries like Ghana and Côte d'Ivoire, initiated subtle policy adjustments, insisting on greater local processing of cocoa and reviewing military agreements. A new era was dawning, one characterized by regional solidarity, economic self-determination, and a collective pushback against exploitative legacies. Traoré's quiet but firm leadership had ignited a movement that challenged the old order, inspiring neighboring countries to rethink their relationships with global powers. Back in Washington and European capitals, officials scrambled to formulate responses. The narrative control that had long been assumed was slipping through their fingers. Media outlets began running stories questioning Burkina Faso's human rights record or economic future. But for every critical segment, dozens of independent voices celebrated the nation's new direction. African intellectuals, once marginalized, spoke openly about the need to resist Western influence, commissioning new books and redesigning university curricula to reflect these shifting realities. Amid the turbulence, one sentiment was clear: Ibrahim Traoré was no longer a distant revolutionary or defendant on trial. He was a symbol of hope and renewal, a leader who had taken on the world's mightiest and emerged with his nation's pride unbroken. As celebrations continued across the capital and beyond, the nation was united in purpose and optimism. Burkina Faso was charting a course not just for survival, but for a future defined by dignity, self-reliance, and collective strength. 3 years after the dramatic trial that captured the world's attention, Ibrahim Traoré stood before the United Nations General Assembly, not as a defendant on trial, but as an elected statesman. The chamber, filled with delegates from nearly every nation on earth, fell silent as he approached the podium. His presence was no longer that of a young revolutionary, but of a leader who had earned his place through resilience, conviction, and steadfast commitment to his people. With measured confidence, Traoré began, "Distinguished colleagues, I come before you today, not to celebrate victories, but to invite partnership, not as a perfect nation, but as one determined to author its own story." His words carried the weight of decades of struggle and the hopes of millions across the global South. He spoke passionately about the need to move beyond traditional power structures, calling for new models of cooperation grounded in mutual respect for sovereignty, cultural context, and capacity building. Traoré outlined a vision of South-South collaboration where nations share technology resources and knowledge in ways that empower rather than dominate. He emphasized the importance of respecting each country's unique culture and history, warning against one-size-fits-all approaches that have long failed developing nations. As his speech concluded, something unprecedented happened. Delegates representing over half the world's population rose in a spontaneous standing ovation. The applause echoed through the chamber, a powerful acknowledgement that Traoré's message resonated far beyond Burkina Faso. It was a moment of pride and inspiration, signaling a shift toward a more inclusive and equitable global order. In a quiet office far from the bustle of the UN, retired Judge Eleanor Richards reflected on the trial she once presided over, a trial she had expected to be routine, but which had upended many assumptions. "History rarely moves in straight lines," she mused. "Sometimes it requires a disruption to find its proper course." Richards acknowledged that the trial revealed uncomfortable truths, not just about a young African leader, but about the international system itself. It exposed the limitations and hypocrisies of a global order that often marginalized voices like Traoré's. The courtroom confrontation had sparked a broader conversation, challenging old power structures and forcing a re-examination of sovereignty, justice, and fairness. Around the world, the trial's impact rippled through universities, media outlets, political debates, and community discussions. It shifted perspectives and encouraged many to question narratives they had long accepted. Judge Richards saw that what had seemed like a local legal proceeding was in fact part of a global awakening, a new story about who holds power and how it should be used. Her reflections carried hope that this awakening might lead to meaningful change, a world where dignity and justice are not privileges, but rights shared by all. The legacy of Ibrahim Traoré's trial continues to live on in classrooms where students debate sovereignty and justice, in media programs that question traditional foreign policy, and in political arenas where leaders reconsider their alliances. Traoré has become a symbol not just of resistance, but of courage to speak uncomfortable truths and reclaim dignity in the face of global pressure. His story inspires activists and thinkers worldwide to challenge imposed narratives and to fight for a future where nations can determine their own paths without interference or coercion. As the story draws to a close, a gentle rain falls over a bustling city, a reminder that change often begins quietly but can ripple endlessly. The conversation sparked in that Washington courtroom has grown into a movement unstoppable and growing. The final call to the audience is clear question: what you are told value sovereignty and justice, and join the ongoing pursuit of a fairer, more respectful world. The story is far from over, it is a beginning. The story of Ibrahim Traoré offers a profound reflection on leadership justice and the ongoing struggle for sovereignty in a world still shaped by power imbalances. At its core, this narrative challenges us to reconsider what it truly means to lead and to be free. Traoré's journey from a young military leader to a statesman addressing the United Nations embodies a courageous refusal to accept imposed narratives and to redefine legitimacy on his own terms. His steadfastness in the courtroom, where he faced accusations crafted by powerful nations, was not just a legal defense, but a moral challenge to a global order that too often sidelines voices from the global South. One of the most striking aspects of his story is the way he humanizes leadership. Instead of portraying power as dominance or control, Traoré frames it as a responsibility to protect the dignity and welfare of one's people. His admission of regret not for his actions but for the long wait and misplaced trust in external help reveals a depth of humility and honesty rare in political discourse. It invites us to acknowledge the complexity of leadership, the sacrifices, the hard choices, and the heavy burden of representing a people's hopes and struggles. Moreover, Traoré's critique of international aid and economic agreements exposes the double standards embedded in global systems. His insistence that sovereignty is a right, not a privilege, calls for a reevaluation of how we understand justice and cooperation between nations. It challenges us to see beyond legalistic frameworks and to engage with the lived realities of those whose voices have been marginalized. This story also invites a personal reflection on our own roles in confronting injustice. Traoré's courage encourages us to question the accepted truths and to stand firm in our convictions even when faced with powerful opposition. It reminds us that change, whether in a nation or within ourselves, often begins with uncomfortable conversations and the willingness to disrupt familiar narratives. Yet it also offers hope. The global response to Traoré's trial, the social movements, the intellectual debates, the shifting political alliances demonstrates that even entrenched systems can be challenged and transformed. It is a testament to the enduring human spirit and the possibility of a more equitable world. As viewers and participants in this ongoing story, we are called to reflect: how do we define leadership and justice in our own lives and communities? In what ways can we support voices striving for dignity and self-determination? And crucially, what truths are we willing to speak even when it is difficult? This story is not just about one man or one nation. It is about all of us in the shared journey toward a world where respect, fairness, and sovereignty are not privileges reserved for a few, but rights enjoyed by all. So I ask you, what truth in your life have you been hesitant to face or speak? What small act of courage can you take today to stand for dignity and justice in your own world? If this story touched you, don't let it stop here. Like, share, and subscribe to Captain of Truth, where every voice matters and every story echoes far beyond the screen. This story is a fictionalized and dramatized narrative created for educational, inspirational, and storytelling purposes. While it may be inspired by real public events, people, or societal issues, it includes imagined dialogue, reconstructed scenes, and character interpretations meant to highlight broader themes of justice, dignity, and resilience. Any resemblance to actual events or individuals beyond public knowledge is purely coincidental. We do not intend to defame, mislead, or harm, but to invite reflection and meaningful conversation. Thank you for watching Captain of Truth.